from Virginia into Tennessee, and my dad was born in Tennessee, and his mother died when he was 2 years old. And then they moved on west, my granddaddy, Hamblen, and then they landed in Decatur, Texas, Wise County, and they moved with the railroad on up to Armstrong County. They filed on land here in 1887. They dug your first dugout in the panhandle, a rock walled, and it's in the Pelladure Canyon on Mesquite Flat on 207. They filed on land when they came into Claude. My daddy's folks and he, and then my mother's grandparents came with the railroad. He was a Baptist preacher, and he furnished the cooking, him and Grandma did, and he followed the rail here to Claude, and then he filed on 4 sections of land in the Pelladure Canyon. And the Hamlins on the north side of the river, and Grandpa Tipton was on the south side of the river on Happy Draw. And my dad filed on some land in Moore County, and he went with another man up there to take care of his cattle. He was a horse breaker. He rode horses, broke horses for the ranchers and the other people. But he found this 16-year-old girl that lived across the river, and he stayed up in Moore County for a year, and then he came back and he finally talked her into marrying him, and they moved back up there and stayed 2 years, and they got the claim out. They came back into the canyon with Grandpa Tipton and Grandma. Then in 1905 they moved out and bought the section of land that were our home place, northwest of Wayside, 2 miles. And then he became a commissioner in Armstrong County in 1928, and he started then to try to make a road across the Pelladure Canyon. He was following the Indian trails mostly on the first go, and he did get it where with the PWA work and so forth in the early 30s, and they did get a road that's passable across the canyon. But the river was the drawback. If it was a little soft, that quicksand, some of them would get bogged up in the quicksand. Then he got it finished, and where cars could go across there and save the people in the southwest corner of Armstrong 120 miles to get to county seat. Then later on, after he was passed on, they did get this road 207 paved and a bridge across the river. And like I said to start with, my dad was a man that broke most all the horses, and this he worked for the Jays, for the Dyes, and other people. And he was, as one fellow said, whenever he got his 6'6" wrapped around a horse, there wasn't much getting him off. And he was a trader. And in World War I, him and another man in Tuyu, Watt Birch, had a contract with the government to buy horses and mules to furnish the army with. At one time, they had about 200 head of horses and mules that they drove from Tuyu, Texas to Mississippi, Jackson, Mississippi, to the fort down there. They had to load those horses on a barge to get them across, or either that or forge it. And they did both. Got some on and some went across. And then, as long as he was commissioner here, he was trading with most anybody that had anything to trade. And that's the way he was when he passed away. He was still riding horses.
before the road came across the canyon, Wayside was pretty much separated from the rest of the county.
That's right.
So how did it develop and differently, and how did they deal with being separate from?
Well, that was the purpose of building this road, was cutting that 122 miles or 120 miles from Wayside to come around the Amarillo to get the float. And that was, of course, back in those days when they had those trails, people crossed there going south. They would put chains around the wheels on the wagons and take them down the hill that way. And they'd go from here to Silverton. The mail route was from Claude to Silverton on horseback back in the early years. And Grandpa Tipton's place was a place of swapping horses, changing horses. A carrier would have a horse there at my Grandpa Tipton's place. And sometimes they would have to stay all night if it was bad weather there with them. But that's the way they carried the mail in from the railroad to Silverton. And at that time, Wayside was Beulah. Had a Beulah post office. Well, then about 15 or 20 miles southeast of there, there's another Beulah. So somebody had to change the name. So they changed from Beulah to Wayside. And I don't know the exact date when that took place. But I know when my dad and them moved out of the county, out of the canyon, they moved to Wayside, and the Bradfords, he bought this section of land off of Bradford's, and she was the postmaster at Beulah at that time. And he sold them, he gave them 50 head of steers, a covered wagon, and a team, and the Bradfords went west to California. And in deeds and things in there, at one time state had leased this place out for 2 cents an acre, and the people couldn't make the payment. They had to turn it back, and that's when the Bradfords bought it, and then he sold it to Dad. And we've lived there ever since 1905.